Welcome to News from Neptune for August 16th in the 33rd week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government a century ago, said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist actually means. It's not easy, owing to generations of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There is nothing remotely like capitalism, in Karl Marx's sense, in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China notably. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on a Ferragosto edition of News from Neptune. Ferragosto is a public holiday celebrated on 15th August and around then in all of Italy. It originates from the Ferie Augustae, the vacations, the public vacation established by the Roman Emperor Augustus in the 1st century BCE, who made the 1st of August a day of rest after the exercises of the harvest. In the 20th century, it was used by the fascist regime in Italy to give the working classes the possibility to visit cultural cities or go to the seaside for 1 to 3 days from the 14th of August to the 16th. Remember that fascism, 20th century fascism, which very different from the way it's being discussed these days, was ostensibly in the interest of the working classes. The Mussolini regime created holiday trains and low-cost tickets to get the lower classes in Italy on the road on this holiday and move them around in order to establish a positive attitude towards the regime. They, in fact, put together a series of August holidays into what they referred to as the Ponte di Ferragosto, the Ferragosto Bridge, so to speak, that ended this summer vacation period for the honor of the state. They were drawing, as they frequently did, on the Roman history of Italy. The Ferie Augustae had been established by the Emperor Augustus in 18 BC after the victory at the Battle of Actium, in which Augustus Octavian conquered Mark Antony. The popular tradition of taking a trip during Ferragosto became quite popular and survived the fascist regime, and to this day there are general public holidays in this period that began with the fascist free tickets for trains in the month of August. So Ferragosto is a cultural background with political, religious, and social roots. It happens to coincide also with the Catholic feast of the Assumption on the 15th of August. So Ferragosto is widely appreciated for a variety of reasons. What's on the top of your list, David, for Ferragosto?
Well, just a note that I came across earlier this morning that today actually is the 200th anniversary of the Peterloo Massacre. August 16th is the actual date. And there's a nice little article on a blog called The Next Recession by Michael Roberts, the British Marxist economist who is very good at explaining these things and contextualizing these things. I haven't had a chance to read it thoroughly yet, but I look forward to doing that, and I always follow whatever Michael Roberts has to say on his blog about the global economy and global capitalism and so forth. Probably not for people that are a little bit conversant with Marxism or somewhat conversant with Marxist economic theories, but I think the Peterloo one might be accessible to a broader audience. An article in the News Gazette, speaking of fascism, aka white nationalism, aka what everybody's talking about these days, and perhaps justifiably so. I'm skeptical of using the term white nationalism as a way of really understanding what's going on in the world or in this country, or especially in Champaign County. But after reading an article in Jacobin the other day, subsequent to the El Paso shooting, I could at least give some credence to the idea that certain all-white suburbs in the Dallas, Texas area where the El Paso shooter came from might be quote-unquote breeding grounds for the kind of ideas that got into the head of this young man. But of course, there's lots of people who live in these white suburbs around Arlington, Texas, and so forth, that don't do what he did. So we need to look at that a little more carefully. An article in the News Gazette from earlier this week entitled "Bend the Arc, Expert in Hate Group Gets Call, Teacher to Lead Event on White Nationalism." The local Jewish group, part of a national group, Bend the Arc, that has sprung up in the Trump era in order to get us to talk about Trump, but not about Zionism, since Jewish values can't be reconciled with what these people call Jewish values can't be reconciled with what's going on in the Middle East at this time. So let's talk about getting a so-called expert on white nationalism to talk to people at Sinai Temple, to spot white nationalism in our schools and in our community. I look askance, as I'm sure you know, Carl, at this sort of thing. I see it as being hypocritical among many other things. But it seems like if Jewish values are all the rage these days among sort of refreshingly among people who don't want to talk about Israel and Palestine, but do want to talk about some of the horrible issues surrounding the way immigrants are being treated in this country, I guess that's fine. It might be a little good, if we're concerned about our Jewish background, Carl, to talk about where some of these ideas come from. Let's talk about the great replacement. Sometimes people just ought to look up Wikipedia. Wikipedia can be really good and helpful with these things. And if you look up the great replacement on Wikipedia, you find that beyond this French fellow named Camus, who's been referred to recently, there is a Jewish woman named Bat Yaor. That's her pen name. And it goes something like this. The similar and more recent conspiracy theory of Eurabia, published by Bat Yaor in her 2005 eponymous book, is often cited as a probable inspiration for Camus' Great Replacement, Eurabia theory, Great Replacement. Eurabia theory likewise involves global entities led by French and Arab powers conspiring to Islamize Europe with Muslims submerging the continent through immigration and higher birth rates. The conspiracy theory also depicts immigrants as invaders or as a fifth column, invited to the continent by a corrupt political elite. Scholars have also pointed out that the use of Great Replacement in Maurice Barré's writing as soon as 1889, 1900, and generally agree that although he did not father the theme, Camus indeed coined the term Great Replacement as a concept and led to its fame in the 2010s. So what's going on with this woman, Bat Yaor, a Jewish woman who is credited with at least some of the background here, and why might it be important for Jewish people to understand this? If you've been studying these things for the last 25 years, like I have, you know who this woman is, and you know the kind of politics that's behind her views. They are the politics of arguing historically that Jews were treated extremely poorly in Arab countries and were driven out after World War II, and therefore the Palestinians who were driven out of Palestine by the Jews, by the Zionists in 1947 through 49, were simply, ironically, a replacement for the Palestinians who had left, and that the Arab countries that from which those Jews came from, didn't want them and drove them out, which is of course not true. It's much more complicated. Bat Yaor, Wikipedia goes on, is the pen name of Giselle Littman, an Egyptian-born British author focusing on the history of religious minorities in the Muslim world and modern European politics. Yaor has popularized the term Dhimmitude, Dhimmitude, in her books about the history of Middle Eastern Christians and Jews living under Islamic governments. Yaor describes Dhimmitude as the, quote, specific social condition resulting from jihad. You can see that where this is going in terms of the kind of political propaganda we've been hearing for the last 20 or 30 or 40 years. And as the, quote, state and fear of insecurity of infidels, quote unquote, who are required, the infidels in this case being the Christians and Jews in Muslim countries, who are required to accept a condition of humiliation, end quote. She has also popularized the term Eurabia in her writings about modern Europe, in which she argues that Islam, anti-Americanism, and anti-Semitism hold sway over European culture and politics as a result of collaboration between radical Arabs and Muslims on one hand, and fascist, socialist, Nazis, and anti-Semitic rulers of Europe on the other hand. So Bat Yaor is pointing the finger at fascists, but her views are being translated into what can be called white nationalism, aka neo-fascism. According to Daniel Pipes, a rabid Zionist and propagandist of this ilk, what Daniel Pipes says about her, Bat Yaor has traced a nearly secret history of Europe over the past 30 years, convincingly showing how the Euro-Arab dialogue has blossomed from a minor discussion group into the engine of the continent's Islamization. In delineating this phenomenon, she also provides the intellectual resources with which to resist it. Will her message be listened to? Daniel Pipes asked. Or according to another historian of this ilk, a well-known historian, Niall Ferguson, quote, future historians will one day regard her coinage of the term Eurabia as prophetic. Those who wish to live in a free society must be eternally vigilant. Bat Yaor's vigilance is unrivaled, said Niall Ferguson. British writer David Price Jones, a less well-known but well-known person of a Zionist persuasion, called her a Cassandra, a brave and far-sighted spirit. On the other hand, the notion of Eurabia has been dismissed, and I think obviously rightfully so, as conspiracy theory by other commentators. For example, writing in the journal Race and Class in 2006, author and freelance journalist Matt Carr states, "In order to accept Yaor's ridiculous thesis, it is necessary to believe not only in the existence of a concerted Islamic plot to subjugate Europe involving all Arab governments, whether Islamic or not, but also to credit a secret and unelected parliamentary body with the astounding ability to transform all Europe's major political, economic, and cultural institutions into subservient instruments of jihad without any of the continent's press or elected institutions being aware of it." Carr also argues that Bat Yaor is the main inspiration for many conspiracy theories on the far right, on the current far right. Furthermore, Carr notes that, quote, "stripped of its Islamic content, the broad contours of Yaor's preposterous thesis recall the anti-Semitic," again, irony, note the irony of this Jewish woman replicating anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and those theories being translated to a certain extent into what is called replacement theory, and which are taken up as white nationalists in this country who are opposed by groups purporting to support Jewish values, quote unquote. Carr goes on, and this is all on Wikipedia, the Wikipedia entry about Bat Yaor. The Euro-Arab axis recall the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of the first half of the 20th century, the Holocaust and all that, and contemporary notions of the Zionist occupation government. Hello, Steve Francis out there, prevalent in far-right circles in the U.S. He notes that Bat Yaor's analysis is driven by contempt of Islam's celebrated cultural achievements and a view of Islam as a perennially barbaric, parasitic, and oppressive religion. Yaor's Eurabia theory gathered additional media attention when it was quoted and praised by the perpetrator of the 2011 Norway massacre, Anders Behring Breivik, in his manifesto released on the day of the attacks. Yaor expressed regret that Breivik took inspiration from her writings. So I understand if the Bend the Arc people who are concerned about white nationalism in the name of Jewish values haven't heard of this woman. I'm kind of a nerd about these things. But it would be helpful for them to sort of complicate their thinking about global politics and white nationalism and conspiracy theorizing, and put Israel into the mix of all that, put Zionism into the mix of all that, and kind of step back a little, maybe be a little bit self-critical about how the Jewish community, given their identification with these ideas through Zionism, that it might help to further our understanding of white nationalism, what can and can't be done about it, given all of my concerns about how seriously that term ought to be taken in the context of what's going on with all these shootings and what's going on in this country and what's going on with Donald Trump and the whole thing.
Thank you, David. You were watching News from Neptune, a Ferragosto edition that is mentioned, in which we've mentioned the Italian fascist, really, holiday of mid-August, late August, and put it in the context of the politics of that are ambiguously called fascist in both the U.S. and in Europe. Links to the articles that we referred to, particularly what David's talking about today, will be on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. A Small note from our chief researcher, Jeff Nicholson, that also has to do with the European situation, and particularly in regard to the climate crisis. Jeff labels this note lead poisoning sur la table. He refers to the Notre Dame fire recently, and the fact that one of the effects of that fire, which now people are saying threatens the integrity of the Notre Dame Cathedral entirely, one of the effects of the fire was to put a lot of lead in the air. And that lead is now settling around Paris. Lawsuits have ensued accusing the government of not warning citizens about the danger of lead exposure early enough to take effective action to protect citizens, particularly children, because, after all, there is no safe amount of lead to ingest, as we've talked about recently in regard to the water supplies in places like Flint, Michigan. The only place that this has been reported in English-speaking news that I'm aware of is RT, the broadcasting service that is to Russia what the BBC is to Britain. And Jeff suggests that perhaps perhaps former President Obama should visit Paris and give a speech as he did in Flint, Michigan, where he said there really wasn't anything to worry about and we would do something about it. And of course, none of that happened. And he could once again, as he did in Flint, fake drinking a glass of Flint's poisoned water and make everything okay by the politics of image. It may be more important to do something serious about it, and the French are actually talking about it as part of the general ecological crisis that we should be talking about, rather than the peculiarities of, say, the American presidential campaign. Whoever is president of the United States doesn't seem to change American policies not much on serious matters, war and ecology, most notably. But
it probably doesn't help to have a president who's such an overt racist as Donald Trump is.
Well, I
You know.
don't disagree with that. Of course, the concentration of the American political establishment on Trump's racism is, to my mind, a way to avoid the serious questions of Trump's acquiescence to the fundamental policies on war and the economy that characterized all recent administrations, notably Obama's. What the American political establishment is most worried about is that Trump will actually do something about the things that he talked about during the campaign, notably war and the environment. The way to keep him from doing that is to make sure that he keeps being attacked for departing from the policies of the last administration, and so far it seems to be working. It's disturbing.
But it doesn't help that he doesn't have a clue as to how he might actually go about fulfilling any of those alleged promises in a serious way. I mean, it's interesting that he has the instincts, sort of, to want to meet with Kim Il-sung, that he has certain instincts about trade agreements and so forth. But the manner in which these policies play themselves out doesn't give any indication that he is willing or is capable of giving any serious thought to how our trade policies might be altered to help the working class, or to challenge the dominance of the military-industrial complex in this country, or to actually, given the vicious sanctioned terrorism, for instance, that's being waged against the people of Venezuela. I mean, I'm not sure why I'm supposed to trust any basic desire on his part to be somewhat of a decent human being.
I think, yeah.
You know,
I don't think we should. I think we spend far too much time being concerned about things like that. That's exactly what the political establishment wants us to do, to be concerned about Trump's personal failings and the opposition to Trump himself, rather than opposition to the policies, the consistent policies followed by the United States on war and economy. Trump is not the problem. Anybody else in his position would be doing essentially the same thing Trump is doing, even though he has been most vigorous in attacking some of those things verbally. The problem is that the political culture of the United States has worked its will on Trump and has used him as a scapegoat while insisting that he follow the policies that all recent administration has followed. Take Afghanistan, for example. Under the radar, literally and figuratively, a debate has been going on that a negotiation has been going on that could conceivably lead to a cessation of hostilities in Afghanistan. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan on false pretenses almost a generation ago. And what's going on right now is that a peace agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban is close, but the working out of that has got to be in terms of the lies about Afghanistan that the United States continues to put forward. This week, Friday of this week, Trump will meet, and this is interesting that it should be announced this way, with a number of top national security figures, the very ones who have enforced the traditional, so to speak, doctrine of Afghanistan upon Trump, most notably Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Secretary of Defense Mark Esper and National Security Advisor John Bolton, to talk about this peace deal that has been worked out under the radar and quietly, most notably by the can't think of Zalmay's last name.
who? Zalmay?
Yeah.
Khalilzad?
Right.
Yeah.
And the idea that Trump will acquiesce to the deal that has been worked out with the Taliban is strongly opposed by the neocons in the administration. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens, and it's interesting that there has been practically no reporting of the peace negotiations and the attempt of the administration this week to come to a conclusion on it. What's going on is that Trump has made comments about this from the time of the campaign. And the establishment, represented by the neocons in office, are doing their darndest to make sure that it's buried, as it has been. You probably haven't heard anything about the negotiations with the Taliban. But unfortunately, Trump's own position on the matter has been obscured entirely in the American media.
I don't agree with that.
What do you agree?
Well, he's not a victim. He's not a passive victim of the people around him.
And and therefore talking about what he says and what he does is not important. What is important is that there is the possibility of a peace agreement in Afghanistan that would lead to the withdrawal of American troops, which Trump has said all along he wanted to do. But the decision is not up to him. The decision is up to the political establishment represented in the administration by the Secretary of State, etc. This is a problem. Trump is not the issue.
But he's not exactly known for saying things and then doing them in the same way. He's not exactly known for following through on what it is that he says.
So why should we be concerned about him at all?
Well, why
What we
we
should be concerned about is
any
American
president.
policy.
Well, so I mean, just to contrast with, obviously contrast him with Obama, it was always assumed that Obama was a kind of a free agent, that things that happened, if Obama was seen as a passive victim, it was only of the Republican Party or the Tea Party or the racists or whatever. He was never seen as a passive victim of Hillary Clinton or Robert Rubin or Timothy Geithner. So, and he wasn't. Obama was very clear about the interests, the class interests that he was willing to represent on his way to becoming president. He reassured them every step of the way that he would take care of their interests first. Did Trump say things that were slightly askew to that he might not take care of those class interests? Yes, he did.
Yes, he did.
Yes, he did. But he's Donald
It
Trump.
doesn't matter. Well, not just because he's Donald Trump, he's president of the United States.
Yeah.
And the question is American policy, not the vagaries of Obama or Trump and their attempts to maintain a propaganda facade that will serve their own interests. That's not the problem. That's not why we're killing people in Afghanistan. That's not why the U.S. is failing to do anything about the serious problems, the serious political problems that face the country. These policies remain consistent and have to be opposed not in the name of this political figure or that political figure, even though we may notice that the mendacious co-option of the anti-war movement made Obama president, and we may notice that Trump has picked up on the populist wave that's affecting not only the United States but the entire world. But the question is, what does the American government do, and whose interest does it serve? It's not a difficult question. It's easy to figure out. And the notion that these things change becomes possible only when there's a popular understanding of what the policies are, what the United States is actually doing, not what the sitting president, whoever he may be, may actually think.
Well,
that's not the issue.
And I mean, obviously, my views about, for instance, the Bend the Arc group as it plays out locally, it's clear that they're basically a Democratic Party function. I mean, they can't organize things on that basis. The Democratic Party, I guess, to whatever rules there are about such things, when they have an event like the No More Cages a couple weeks ago, it's not the Democratic Party that's involved in that, but it's clear, and they even say on their website that their goal is to elect Democratic Party candidates, or to turn to turn Trump out of office next year, and that along with their very narrow scope and their sort of self-adoring, their self-proclamation of their devotion to human rights and anti-racism and all that absolutely leaves me cold. And their focus on Trump, insofar as they do, which they do, leaves me cold, because obviously it isn't engaging the broader debate. In fact, They explicitly, the National Bend the Arc, I looked on their website last night, there's not much there. The National Bend the Arc group, this Jewish group, claims to be the only, I think it claimed to be the only Jewish group that was focused only on domestic issues. In other words, they're proud of the fact that they want nothing to do with the rest of the world, which obviously includes Israel and Palestine, a pretty important issue when you're talking about people who claim to be moral leaders in terms of Jewish values. So I don't take it at all seriously in terms of a political program, but people are attracted to this because it gives them a way. It's a form of identity politics, for one thing.
Yep.
And Jewish identity politics. Everybody else has identity politics.
Why not?
Well, why shouldn't Jews? And so to proclaim your values along with your identity as sort of coterminous with that seems to be a problematic way to begin to talk about global politics and what needs to be done. We need solidarity not on the basis of identity, but on the basis of class.
A footnote here that occurs to me, David, on this. We should point out that your discussion of this of the great replacement theory and the development of this political line does not depend upon Albert Camus, the Camus you're speaking of. Well, I think for a lot of people, the Camus, when you mention the name Camus...
a currently living person, actually.
Yeah, when you mention the name Camus, though, they think of the Nobel Prize-winning French literature, and this is, in fact,
I didn't
not
use
he at
his
all.
first name here because apparently I clipped out a part from Wikipedia that he must have already been previously mentioned, so I didn't. His name.
His first name is
Roland.
Yes, Roland. I think is right.
Okay.
Yes, it's not out of the question. I'm just to complicate the matter a bit to read a little about Albert Camus and to look at the peculiar politics of his time,
Pied Noirs and all that.
Exactly. Camus died young. In his 40s, and his comments on the politics of basically the period after the Second World War bear reflection in terms of the general issues we're talking about today on News from Neptune. What's next?
Well, I don't have anything here, but I'm just going to mention one thing.
Okay.
If people want to look, I'm not going to make another extended reading, but there's a guy named there's a Jewish Israeli Zionist guy named Yoram Hazony running around. Have you heard of this fellow?
No, I haven't.
He's been around for a long time. In fact, Robert I. Friedman, in this book, this 1992 book, Zealots for Zion, inside Israel's West Bank settlement movement, has an article, a chapter about Yoram Hazony, who was a Princeton graduate. Interestingly enough, at Princeton in the 1980s, you had this fellow, Yoram Hazony, who ended up being a West Bank settler and a quote-unquote philosopher. You had Michael Oren, whom you know is my favorite person, and the former ambassador, Israeli ambassador, another American expatriate who became Israeli ambassador to the U.S., and you had Norman Finkelstein. And I've never heard anybody tell any stories about how all these people get along with each other. But this fellow, Yoram Hazony, who has this book that's being reviewed in respected journals, let's say respected conservative journals, The Virtue of Nationalism. The Virtue of Nationalism, Basic Books 2018, was selected as the conservative book of the year for 2019. The Virtue, I don't take this fellow very seriously, but some people do, and it's kind of astonishing that they do. If you read the late Robert A. Friedman was a wonderful journalist, unfortunately died at age 51 in around 2001. He did wonderful work on covering the origins of the West Bank settlements in the 1980s. This fellow, Yoram Hazony, was on one of the Gush Emunim Block of the Faithful settlements. And this guy has had legs in Jewish Israeli culture, in academic culture, in sort of Zionist philosophical culture, including in this country. But when you look at it carefully, it's really all about white nationalism. It's a form of white nationalism, prettied up in various ways. And again, Jewish people, I know about this because of my nerdy interest in these things, or my political interest in these things. People ought to know, people ought to start asking questions and be puzzled about what the relationships are between nationalisms and other nationalisms. And of course, they also ought to be puzzled about what's the relationship between ideas that people get in their heads and their actual actions. When people kill other people, when people post a manifesto or whatever it is on the web, and then go out and shoot some people, people assume, well, this is what motivated them. And I think we have to complicate that quite a bit in terms of who these people are. We have to complicate it in terms of the availability of firearms. We have to complicate it in all kinds of ways, including how the society works. But if I was to pick one thing that I would say that people should be more serious about, because it's possible, is to do with the firearm issue, with the gun issue. That's something we could actually do something about.
Right.
Don't you think?
Yes.
There's a lot of things. We can't change the world overnight. We can't change capitalism overnight. But a concerted movement to outlaw privately owned firearms and to have the police not carry firearms and only to have them in reserved situations, that would be something that I would take seriously as a real movement, as opposed to sitting around at Sinai Temple and talking about white nationalism and how to stop it in our schools.
I find it interesting that the situation is so appalling. People are so horrified by the fact that mass shootings in the United States are now more than one a day, which in this calendar year, and that's so far beyond anything that happens anyplace else that one has to talk about what it is in peculiarities in American culture that this mass murder becomes generally accepted. And I'm actually, hard to be optimistic, I'm actually faintly encouraged by the fact that this rabble who are running for the Democratic presidential nomination have really found they've just really recently, in the last week and so, have found they've got to say something about it.
Yeah.
And the otherwise forgettable Beto O'Rourke has been as clear as any of them on calling for a gun ban and a gun buyback and the prohibition of assault weapons and things of this sort. Other members of that peculiar fraternity and sorority are feeling that they've got to say something that sounds progressive on this matter. But at least the conversation is taking place in a way it would not have a little while ago. I have no brief for Beto O'Rourke or any of the rest of them, with the possible exception of Tulsi Gabbard. And it's still interesting that they now know they got to talk about it.
Yeah. And yeah, I a couple weeks ago, I read a brief excerpt from an academic study of deaths by firearms, comparing the U.S. to other rich countries. There's a lot of poorer countries that have much more higher homicide rates and firearm and maybe not firearms. Anyway, they were compared to rich countries, and if you look at those numbers, and if you look at the 5 per 100,000 or so deaths by firearms that the United States is quote unquote willing to live with, that means about 15,000 deaths per year, both homicide and suicide. That would be, most of which would possibly be preventable by a much stricter firearms policy, perhaps like what they have in Australia. But in any of these other countries, they just don't have the deaths by guns that we do. And people are willing to live with that. And I think if people looked at the data and it became a little more socially acceptable for people to argue in the face of all these people who want their guns, and not just the NRA, but just people who think, well, you can't have that. Well, you can't desegregate that. You can't desegregate the South. People aren't ready for that. People aren't ready to give up their firearms. Well, if they knew everybody else was, if they knew that that's what people wanted, if people weren't afraid to say that, and if people were clear that the cops would have to give theirs up, that's important, I think, then we can start to talk about these things. I think it's going to have to obviously be the most sort of pacifistic type people to do that, but it shouldn't be just pacifists.
And the remarkable thing is the discussion apparently is threatening to become public in the Democratic Party. There are other things, of course. I mean, this unlikely praise would be too strong. This unlikely mention of the Democratic Party on this program should not go to our heads. They are not, in the words of the great baseball coach, they are who we thought they were. And there's no question about that. Aaron Matei, who is fast becoming the leading American reporter, I think, on issues like this, has a talk this week on how compliant the Democratic Party is as the Trump administration intensifies its anti-Venezuela sanctions by a new executive order. Now, as I say, the point here is the things that are not being said in American politics while we obsess about the character of the chief executive. What actually the government is doing, and it really doesn't make too much difference if I try to decide whose fault within the government that it is that they're doing it. They're all doing it. The result of the anti-Venezuela policy, the attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government, is devastating on Venezuela. An economist by the name of Rodriguez claims that U.S. sanctions against Venezuela, this is in Aaron Matei's stuff, will likely cause a famine in Venezuela and hundreds and thousands of deaths. Given the information we have, the most reasonable conclusion based on the data is that a famine is going to occur in Venezuela over the course of the next 12 months. Now, this famine is not an accident. This is the direct result of American policy in Venezuela, of the American coup against Venezuela, the American attempted coup, which did not come out quite as neatly as the American government wanted it to. John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, wants Venezuelan President Maduro to withdraw, allowing the U.S. to launch new elections and produce a government that we're happy with, a government that, in oil politics particularly, Venezuela is a major producer of oil, will be consistent with American foreign policy and the ongoing attempt of America to control the flow of oil around the world as the best weapon against our economic rivals, particularly Russia and China. Now, these politics are very close to the heart of the American government, and as usual, the American government is not worried about killing thousands of people in order to put these policies into effect. Once again, one of the few people actually talking about it in the American media is Aaron Matei, and I'll put a link to his discussion of this matter, which runs very deep in the policies of the current administration and the previous administration as well, for that matter, on our usual Facebook page for references. This is not a new policy by the United States. Former CIA agent John Stockwell, who wrote about similar American policies literally 2 generations ago, said, and I'm quoting here from his 1989 book, "The point is to put pressure on the targeted government by ripping apart the social and economic fabric of the country." Now, those words, social and economic fabric, means making the people suffer as much as you can until the country plunges into chaos, until at some point you can step in and impose your choice of governments on that country. This is not a new policy. This is the sort of policy the U.S. has been following really for a century, but notably since the Second World War, when the U.S. emerged as the only undamaged major country in the world and was able to get away with this sort of stuff. Africa has been the scene of a good deal of the inculcation of this policy, and now we're seeing it in the case of Venezuela and Latin America, which of course goes back literally generations. This is the sort of thing our news program should be talking about, the crimes that the government we're responsible for committing around the world, the very great crimes that are happening here, and instead we get notions about whether Donald Trump is a good guy or not, I guess.
Well, given that the lives of Venezuelans certainly are as important as the lives of immigrants coming, refugees fleeing across our southern border, maybe the bend the arc people, if they don't want to venture out too far into the world, if they want to just stay in this hemisphere, they might like to talk about what it is, how it is that you can still not be white nationalist and not care about the fact that we're trying to starve people to death in Venezuela, and why we're not just as responsible for that as we are for children in cages along our southern border or wherever else people might be kept in confinement. I'm not saying that everybody has to do everything, everybody has to know everything. It's a matter of having a certain consistency in how we view the structure of the whole system and how it's working, and then picking battles that can A, serve to educate people as to how the world works, and B, actually be won. It seems like most decent Americans are opposed to starving people in Venezuela for no reason whatsoever that anybody can even say, except to say that they're being ruled by this dictator, quote unquote dictator, which they're not, which he's not.
But we've got the supposedly liberal part of the American media, like Democracy Now, spending its time talking about the presumed crimes and delicts of the Maduro government. Not what our country is doing that will result in mass death, and has already in Venezuela.
And the New York Times continues to be on this anti-Venezuelan rampage.
Exactly.
This week they had an article about the military, the relationship between, apparently they accused Maduro basically of killing one of the military people. I mean, it's just, they're going out of their way to demonize the government of Venezuela in the midst of these sanctions.
Reporter Aaron Mate reminds us that the Democrats are supporting the coup in Venezuela under Trump, perhaps because that coup, the plans for the coup, began under Obama. It's a continuing policy, once again, of Obama and Trump, and the attempt to try to say, well, this is all Trump's fault, is simply false. Mate says, and I quote, "A handful of Democrats, including Ilhan Omar, Bernie Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, and Ro Khanna, have opposed regime change in Venezuela. But even then, their opposition is tepid, qualified, and pretty rare. Just imagine if things were different. Imagine how much harder it would be for Trump, Bolton, and Mike Pompeo to deny food and medicine to millions of Venezuelans if any of their critics in Congress or in the media would make this an issue. But that hasn't happened. Since this embargo was announced, Trump's critics in Congress, mostly Democrats, and in the media have not even mentioned it. So really the Trump administration is not just relying on a strategy here of making the Venezuelan people suffer, it's also relying on the assumption that the Trump administration won't face any domestic resistance for starving and besieging Venezuela. And so far that plan is working. So the resistance saying, well, we've got to impose Trump here, means nothing, because there is no effective resistance to the U.S. government plan for Venezuela that began under the last administration and continues under the current one.
So I noticed you had an article up on Counterpunch there by this Jennifer Matsui
Yes.
about Jeffrey Epstein, and we really can't let this week go by without at least
really
mentioning our dear departed friend.
This article, I'll put a link to this article at the top of the Facebook page. This is an important article and a devastating article in a lot of ways, but it draws together the really sort of horrifying things that are revealed, by the death of this man Epstein and by his career, if we can put it that way. It's very disturbing. It's a connection with the career of Robert Maxwell, the father of Epstein's great and good friend, who apparently was working as a procuress for him. and leads deeply into the politics of Israel and the United States over more and Great
Yeah.
Britain over more than a generation. It's absolutely horrifying, and if we had a reasonable amount of time, we would be talking about that.
Just more fodder for Ben the Ark to deal with in terms of what are Jewish values and how is it that these horrible how is it that there seem to be so many horrible people, horrible Jewish people involved in this circle? I'm not I'm not saying it does and it doesn't, but again, I've been around this stuff, been looking at this stuff for long enough to know that you find these rich people, they're going to be Zionists, they're going to find favor, they've given lots of money. Jeffrey Epstein has been involved with Les Wexner and the Alan Dershowitz and all these people. There just has to be at some point. There just has to be this big discovery that about how all this works, where people would wake up and see, maybe we've got a class issue in Jewish values in this society, and Israel has something to do with that.
I think that last point is a remarkable aspect
We
of the
got 3
discussion.
minutes now. Yeah.
But the 3 minutes to talk about
Yeah.
the Mossad,
Yeah.
the Israeli secret police, and the Israeli spy system, and its involvement with Epstein and
Yeah.
Robert Maxwell
Yeah.
and the British government. Maxwell himself was offed, apparently, by a murder plot that Mossad may well have been involved with. And there are people suggesting that Epstein himself was a victim of the Mossad. It's not out of the question.
No, it's not.
And
Just another conspiracy theory that
but it's
is probably never going to be proved, but we should take seriously.
exactly. That's the point.
Yeah.
And we both sigh at the same
Well,
point. Yeah.
as Chevy Chase might say, we'll get back to Jeffrey Epstein next week because he'll still be dead.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true. You've been watching you've been watching News from Neptune for the 33rd week of 2019, a Ferragosto edition that seems appropriately bound up in various ways with fascism. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young. See the research notes from J.B. Nicholson on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, along with references that we've referred to tonight. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. It's a heavy burden. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.